This is Georgia Lee Hussey. I'm an out entrepreneur.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. And on this week's episode, I am super excited to be introducing you all to Georgia Lee Hussey, who is a local out boss here in the Portland area. So we are recording live, which is always a treat. Welcome, Georgia.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah. So are you ready to inspire fellow out entrepreneurs?
I will do my very best.
Yes, no doubt. So just a little bit of context about who Georgia is before we jump into the questions. So Georgia is the founder and CEO of Modernist Financial, which is a B Corp wealth management firm dedicated to helping progressive people structure their wealth around their values. I love that. Her mission is to build a world where smart, creative people feel permission to enjoy today while providing a stable financial base for our common future. Before launching Modernist, Georgia worked for national and local financial firms as a certified financial planner, and prior to working in finance, she was a sculptor and writer. So I'm excited to hear about your origin story of how you've arrived where you are today. So Georgia, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit more about your business and what makes it unique?
Sure. So Modernist is a wealth management firm, which is a diffuse term as the way it's used in the industry. And so I think it's helpful to define what that means. So we do comprehensive financial planning for our clients, and we also do investment management for our clients. We actually manage their money and invest it in stocks and bonds, et cetera. The focus of the firm is helping people, as you said, structure their wealth around their values. And that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand how different financial structures operate and what is the impact of those structures on the things that we believe in. I personally come from a pretty left progressive perspective, in part because of my queerness and in part just of my origin story. But it's very clear to me that financial structures are inequitable. And when we have wealth, it requires us to think deeply and meaningfully about how the choices we make impact the broader community, world, various folks that we engage with in our communities. And so the firm is really focused around that work, whether it's tax planning. Do you really want to have the very lowest tax bill that you can when that's what funds our parks and our schools, et cetera? Thinking about charitable giving, what does that mean? How do we structure that around what's important to us as individuals? Our investments, what are we thinking about? Sustainability, child labor, warfare, et cetera. And then how do we talk about money? How do we talk about money with ourselves? How do we talk about it with our partners? How do we discuss it with the next generation above or below us? And then how do we talk about it in community? Money is a verboten topic culturally, especially in white dominant culture and many other cultures as well, in part because I think money is power, and so it hides. But my hope is that the firm helps people both do the day-to-day things like how am I spending my money, to how am I investing my money, to how am I dealing with taxes? And then also this more meta question of who am I in relationship to the wealth that I've accumulated?
Wow. Okay. So I think these are really powerful questions to ask. And just thinking about this piece on values. So you posed a lot of questions here to think through. Walk us through how you work with a client to clarify what their values are. And then once they have them, their values around money and wealth management. And then once they have them, how do you work with a client to kind of go back to those values if you feel as their advisor, hey, you might be a little bit out of alignment here. Remember what you wrote on paper. So what does that look like? What's that process?
It's definitely an iterative and creative process, I would say. And my arts background has made me an excellent entrepreneur, I would say, because learning how to roll with new ideas and implement quickly has been extremely helpful for me. But I would say that the process itself, we lean very hard into a part of financial planning called financial life planning, which is really where we try and acknowledge the academic work that's been happening around behavioral finance and theories of adult learning, family of origin theory, and saying, who are we as financial beings, and how does that support the decisions that we make? And so our onboarding process is quite extensive and really digs deep into goals and financial history. So we'll ask questions like, what did you learn from your mother about money? What did you learn from your father about money? I'm always interested in them be like, what did your mother learn from her mother and her father about money? Clarifying what we've inherited in terms of story and narrative around who we can be in relationship to money. And this is deeply influenced by our identities, whether it's our gender identity or sexual identity, whether we think of ourselves as creative or not creative, or a math person or not math person, our race, our class, all it's deeply individual.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we have a long process for that is really, especially for partners, is a really amazing opportunity to collaboratively understand who each person is, and also be able to show up with a lot of compassion, which I think is deeply important around money conversations. And so one of the takeaways that people have in the process is a narrative of who they want to be in 5 years. And it's very qualitatively driven. It's basically saying, Rhodes is 5 years in. Rhodes is delighted with his relationship with money, his relationship with the conversations with his partner, the decisions he's made, the ways that he's shifted his behavior. Because basically, financial planning is all behavior change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, this thing is coming. How are you going to address that?
Yeah.
And so that document, we sit down, it gets put in front of our client at every meeting thereafter.
Nice.
So they have a chance to just scan it.
Yeah.
And then I might ask them to say, is there anything that resonates for you that you want to discuss in this estate planning meeting, this charitable giving meeting, this tax planning meeting? And CPAs are a little surprised to have that question asked, but it's really helpful because it makes us say, oh, maybe the most important thing is not the most amount of deductions. It's actually, how can we have the most charitable giving, whatever it might be. So it's about, to me, documenting the vision of the future and then making a regular habit of referring back to that vision.
Yeah, that visualization piece is so powerful. When I was first working with my financial advisor, she challenged me and she was like, all right, so you're waking up at 72. Where are you waking up? What's around you? And I'm like, wait, what? And it was just like that reality check of, your younger self being kind to your older self. And just to, in a lot of ways, I interview a lot of coaches on, like career coaches and whatnot on the show. And I feel like the role of a financial advisor is a lot of like a money coach, right? Of just kind of like work on your relationship with the thing that kind of dominates our, our system, our society, and the way we structure ourselves. I wanted to think about our audience and all of the expertise that you bring around financial planning. What's one thing that you think business owners in general, maybe LGBT business owners in particular, that you see that you're surprised that they don't know that maybe they ought to?
I would say that becoming clear about your story is very important. I know that for me, as a queer person, as a creative person, as a person who identifies as female, and femme also actually in there is interesting, this sense that I am not supposed to have access to the world of money or finance, and I'm not supposed to be good at it. And if I like lipstick, that means I am not good at managing money. Or I like shoes, and that means that I am not good at managing money. And those are all false stories that are propagated by basically white supremacist patriarchy that is all about putting people in a place where they cannot feel empowered around their behavior.
Yes.
And I think coming up as a queer kid in a pretty left punk rock kind of community, money was evil. That business is bad and evil. All of these really, I've had one client call it the punk damage.
That's so, real.
That's super real, especially if you hold more progressive or left perspectives on politics. And getting clear about that is really helpful because you can really undermine your success by continuing to believe those stories. And so we like to say that our money stories are basically the pre-written financial plan that we have in our heads that we're not conscious that we're operating from. And so I think getting clear is super important and finding a way to shift that story so that it can be more supportive for us going forward. Shame doesn't help us in the closet, and it does not help us with money.
That's great. That's great. I think you might have named this episode here. Wow, that's really great. And I think, so this is a very woo-friendly show, as well as, don't hold any punches about white supremacy and the patriarchy, for sure. So I was watching an Abraham Hicks video last night, full disclosure, but it was about this kind of the vibration, right? The vibration that you set off. And there was someone who was like, I really want to win the lottery. And so, the spiritual medium is basically asking, this participant, her audience, well, what does it feel like when you have that? And he couldn't describe it, and she was just like, if you want that, you have to be in that moment. You have to feel it. All five senses and more need to be activated. And I'm wondering, like in the work that you do, I mean, it sounds like you're doing this very subtly, probably with a lot of the folks that you're working with. But do you push people to kind of like really define when they're doing their values, also like that kind of exercise, like in the future you, when you wake up, and how do you do that?
I love the arts for all kinds of grounding, visioning work. It's certainly where I go as an entrepreneur when I need inspiration. The Portland Art Museum is a much better place for me to go than the business section at Powell's. That's very important to me. I think about the work of Ari Seth Cohen, who has Advanced Style. I don't know if you know that blog. It is fabulous. He basically started out taking photographs of amazing women over 60 on the streets of New York, and it is full of these extraordinary humans being basically super stylish in their 70s, 80s, 90s, et cetera. He has a new book out called Advanced Love that's very LGBTQIA plus friendly and really inspiring and super sweet. So I find that just having images of who we could be is incredibly powerful. And, I came out when I was in high school as a senior. I was the only out kid. A couple other people came along. I went to all-girls Catholic school, so it wasn't really easy coming out.
I'm sorry. I'm glad you made it through.
I actually loved the Catholics. The nuns were amazing, and I think that's also where I developed gaydar, where I was like, I don't think you're just a nun. Sweet, wonderful women that they were, actually. But I think that developing an idea of who we could be is so important. And to me, the arts are a really powerful way to do that. Whether it's looking at advanced style, or it's reading novels about older people, or it's watching movies. There's that beautiful movie Amour, that's sort of an almost silent French film that I love. It's about an older couple, though seemingly heterosexual. It's at that point in their lives, they become almost genderless in the way that they show up in the world. And it's to those places that I go, and that I encourage my clients to find role models. But know when we look for role models, we have permission to just take a piece of that person. Because it's hard to find, like when I ask people who their financial role models are, it's often very difficult for people to come up with a person. But if I give them permission to say just a piece of how they show up, it's a lot easier to sort of then make an amalgam of, your Aunt Ronnie and your, so on and so forth, and this CEO, and you can create somebody who's more reflective of what your values are.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it goes to kind of the role model versus the possibility model, right? Of just like adapting and like what you're saying, you really have to see it to be it, and just kind of pushing people, if you don't see exactly what you want, kind of make that collage, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point when we think about those people who have been systematically disenfranchised from wealth building. It is extremely, when I think about people in my position, so as a CFP, 83% of CFPs are white men over the age of 58.
Wait, say that stat again.
83% of CFPs are white men over the age of 58, average, which means there are a whole lot of them that are over 58 years old. And my experience is that the majority of the industry tends to be quite conservative politically, and majority probably identify as straight. So literally, it's hard to see what we can be in the financial industry. So one of my focuses as a firm is, long-term, how can we help build a pipeline of talent so people who normally don't either have access or may not even have a CFP in their community? Because only 3% of CFPs are people of color. Wow. 3%. Wow. It's shameful. And so, and they don't even track stats on queerness.
Yeah. No. Trust me, I'm used to that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that is important to me is that in order to do the work with a planner who's actually qualified to do the work, it's important that you can show up with somebody who looks like you or acts like you, or you feel a sense of home and comfort. Because these conversations are they can be difficult to have, or they can be intimidating. But if it's with somebody that we feel like we can trust or sees us, it's much easier. So that's an important element of my mission in the work, is creating a diverse pipeline of talent into the business.
Yes, that's all super important points, and kind of goes into the next question that I typically ask guests, which is they're sharing a little bit about their origin story, their business origin story. And it sounds fascinating going from basically being an artist, a sculptor, right, and going into the world of finance, using the examples that you gave, where you get motivated in business by going to, the Portland Museum of Art. And anyway, can you share just a little bit about how you went from artist to artist financial planner? Yeah.
Thank you for that title. I appreciate that. So I studied installation sculpture and creative writing when I was at Sarah Lawrence. I had gotten a ginormous scholarship. Thank you, scholarship fund. I was ever so grateful to go to a school where I felt like I had total permission to be weird.
Yeah.
And it's like such a queer, positive culture as well. It felt like I had permission to be my full self there. And that was such a gift. And my work at the time was basically as a sculptor, anything that had to do with fire, I was really into it, whether it was welding or glass blowing or metal smithing or casting wax, or I loved the sort of alchemical from solid to liquid and back to solid again process. Yeah. And then I also did a lot of performative work that was around gender and labor and how we define who can do what. So basically, I was also really attracted to types of media that were predominantly male owned. So I wasn't making embroidery, I was welding kind of thing. And I'm also a very femme person is how I show up in the world and my gender identity. I always liked that combination, I would say. And it's funny, I feel like finance is basically the same thing. I'm like back in welding.
Yes, 83%. I'm still like, and 3% POC. I'm just, anyway. Okay, I'm glad you're in the field.
Me too.
Yes.
And so I think basically I tried to be an artist and I was writing a lot at that time, a lot of creative nonfiction. And I don't come from a family of means. If anything, I come from a family that needs my support. Though I was gifted a lot of fabulous education by a mother who worked a lot of jobs to keep me in situations where I could be well educated, I didn't have the resources that a lot of the successful artists that I knew had. And unfortunately, we have an economic creative structure in America that requires resources.
Yes.
Or you just go deeply, deeply in debt. And you might become Julian Schnabel, but I think that's probably, I don't know what the stats are, but I bet it's harder than getting into the MBA. It's super difficult.
For
as
sure.
you probably well know. At some point, I had bounced between New York and Portland several times in Europe. And then finally I was like, all right, I'm going to have to transition out of being an artist. I'm going to have to come up with another focus for myself. So I made the decision to come back to Portland, where I had built a really lovely creative community. And I did the practical thing as buying a house that I couldn't afford in 2006 in the soon-to-be subprime mortgage crisis. And I was like, oh, God, I don't know anything about money. And I certainly don't know how to pay for my mortgage on a commission paycheck, which I'd always done sales to support my art practice. And so I basically didn't know anything about that, taught myself, because I'm a good autodidact. And so I just taught myself everything I could about money, found myself shamefully fascinated, and then realized that nobody I knew anything about money either. And I was like, oh, we are in serious trouble if y'all don't know anything either. And then my friends were starting to get book deals and record deals. And I was like, oh, no. How are we going to build wealth as a creative community, as a queer community, as a community of people who identify as women, all of whom have been, I believe, systematically told we're not supposed to be good at money or wealth building? And so I basically sold that house and became a financial planner. Originally with an intent of working primarily with the creative community. But as I've gone further into my career, it became really clear, and in part because of the 2016 debacle, I decided that the progressive portion was so important, because as I have learned more and more about how money works, it's all political. Tax planning is a reflection of policy. And does that policy support the values that I think are important or that a lot of my clients do? Usually not.
Right.
And so that is really where, though a lot of our clients still identify as creative, and I think I'll always attract those kind of people, I believe that the focus on the progressive values really is, again, getting back to my punk rock, troublemaking, performance art roots.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you're finding a way to game a system, like you said, that systematically leaves out so many of us, other than the 83% of the white guys in the field, right? And I think it's so valuable that you're thinking of ways of sharing the knowledge that you've gained basically by teaching yourself, and then, probably going through more formal routes of getting certified, right? But that's just, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I went into business as a queer person, where I wanted to change the way the workplace worked. And what better way when you're kind of steering the ship, as hard as that is, right? To really find your why. And it seems like super clear why you're doing what you're doing. And I'm super inspired by that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk more about what brings you to the Rainbow family. First, we're going to go to a quick sponsorship break. Hey, Out Bosses, Rhodes Perry here. As you all know, part of my passion for this podcast is to empower you and fellow LGBT entrepreneurs to cultivate a feeling of purpose and belonging in your business. To know that you can show up and be the most authentic version of yourself. Purpose, belonging, and workplace culture are concepts I take seriously in my own consulting business. In fact, I'm on a mission to empower leaders just like you and those on their way to joining us to cultivate cultures of belonging. In my upcoming book, Belonging at Work, I share some of my personal struggles of coming out as a trans guy in the workplace and how I leverage this experience as one of my business superpowers. Now, I'm on a mission to support you in taking simple actions that will make a world of difference for anyone who has ever felt as if they needed to hide important aspects of themselves on the job. When you commit to purchasing a special, limited edition copy of the book, a portion of your purchase will support expanding workplace opportunities for fellow transgender and non-binary people. An added bonus, your story about what it means to belong at work will be featured on the book's website to inspire others. You're ready to belong at work now. To learn more, visit rhodesonamazon.com or text 444-999 and type the word belong. Again, that's rhodesonamazon.com or text 444-999 and type belong. So we are jumping back into the interview with Georgia. Georgia, I wanted to talk a little bit about your identity, what brings you into the Rainbow family, which is I love the Rainbow family. That's why I do the show. But I like to kind of talk about that in the context of the workplace. And I'm wondering if you could take us back to a time when you were probably working for someone else, most likely in the financial field, I don't know. But a time where you couldn't show up authentically and really be yourself as a queer member of the Rainbow family, similar to how you felt at Sarah Lawrence and the way you described that.
Yeah. So when I first got into the business, it was the depths of the recession. And I wanted to work for a firm like the one I own now, but none of them were hiring because they did not have the resources to grow at that point. And so basically, the only place I could find a job was at a big brokerage firm, like one of those things you see like tons of ads for everywhere you go. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to start my business there because I had a desk and I had an office and I had an assistant to help me with paperwork and I had portfolios and so on. I had a lot of support and infrastructure and freedom to build the business in the way that I wanted. I was one of 3 women who were brokers out of about 50 white men. All of the support staff were women. There were no out queer people. There were a couple of people of color, and they were all in basically the back office. It was so shocking to me. And I didn't know how to, I'd never been in business. So I didn't know how to show up. And I was very uncertain of myself I don't know if I was uncertain, but I was protective. I think that's a better way of saying it. I was protective of myself and my identity in a space that did not feel safe. And with a group of people who I think have good intentions, but don't even realize that they're making people feel unsafe in most circumstances. And so it showed up mostly, as in most things, in my worries about style. And I was like, how do I come to the office?
Yeah.
What do I wear? How do I show up as a queer woman in finance when there's basically not many I can find? And the ones who are around that are most visible for all the usual reasons are people who might be more masculine identifying.
Sure.
Right, which is not how I roll personally. And so it was interesting. I was commenting recently to my partner about how constrained I felt at that time and how free to be myself I feel now. And just trying to figure out how to fit in without giving in, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so now I feel like I can show up exactly how I am, and I just seem to get like femmier and femmier as time comes on, and the clothes get more and more flamboyant, and I'm delighted to be able to live that truth, because I realize that's my power.
Yeah.
That's what people are attracted to, and people want to be around somebody who feels like authentically themselves. And that the differentiation, I feel like I had to relearn, freshman year of high school and be like, oh no, they're boring. I don't want to fit in with them.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
I love that what you just said, trying, like, not resisting the urge to fit in, which would then allow you to kind of give in, or you said it better than I did, but this was really lovely. You had said, and I think this might be helpful for some of the folks who are tuning in, the space when it didn't feel safe. It sounds like that was really subtle. Like it was enough for you to kind of look around and just visibly see, okay, there are very few women here. There are very few people of color, and those that are here are in largely support positions, like off to the sides, like not even visible. And so was that like just enough for you to be like, okay, if this is the reality, then I can't even dress in like a very visible femme kind of way, or like, were there other things?
Yeah, I mean, it's just some of the people who worked there literally never spoke to me, because I don't think they knew how to speak to a woman who was an equal.
Yeah.
And there were some comments that were made, especially the Obama 2012 election was happening while I was there. And there were some things that I heard. I was like, oh, I'm actually not safe here.
Yeah.
And I am safe because I am a white woman with a lot of privilege and a lot of education, and I hold a certain space in spaces with white straight men that I know how to take. I know how to take care of myself in those situations, but they're not by showing up as my authentic self. They're by showing up in the ways that let me retain the power that I have available to me.
Yeah.
So I would say those are some of the ways that I saw it, but a lot of people's understanding of what gender identity and sexual identity are is very rudimentary, if any at all. And so I don't trust those people. I didn't trust those people enough to even have those conversations with them.
Yeah.
It was not, it would not have served me.
Yeah.
And so it was easier for me to just lay somewhat low, do my job, be fabulous at it for myself and in my definition, because they also thought the way I was doing business was crazy. They're like, why would you want to talk to people about their money, about their relationship with their money? They'd be like, you need to sell product. Wow. And I'm like, I'm not selling product. That's not what we're doing.
No.
Because I also knew that I was eventually going to be going in this direction because that kind of organization would not support the vision that I have now, which is now why I run my own firm, and so had to start my own firm, because generally the people who I was working with, they just thought I was nuts and that it wouldn't be profitable, and that, a lot of things that I think they're deeply wrong about, and thankfully I get to prove on a daily basis. But yeah, I think it is a lot of microaggressions.
Yeah.
And it's also just reading the room and seeing what people value and be like, yep, you don't value what I value. And I don't think I need to have that conversation with you.
Yeah. And it's this, the conversation piece is really huge. And it's interesting that those that were your equals, or even however the structure was, that actually aligns with what happens in larger organizations in general, where it's like more than 50% of managers, so not necessarily your peers, are just afraid to talk to the people that they manage, period. Not talk about like politics or, sexual orientation or gender identity, just talking, which is just mind-boggling. So, I mean, it makes sense if a culture is out of alignment and you have the fire in your belly and you have the means to just get started, even with sweat equity. Sometimes that is the path of least resistance, but the path with the risks that you do take, it does generate a lot of wonderful rewards, and one of which is just showing up, knowing that you can wear what you want to wear. You can, in a professional manner, talk with your colleagues about what you want to talk about, and really set the tone for, being open and having conversations and seeing other people for the value that they bring to the work that you do.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that I am the CEO, so I hold a lot of power as a person who can talk about what she wants to.
Right, yes.
So one of the things that really drives me to run a company is looking at what wasn't right or is not right in the industry at large and in business at large, to say, how could we be different in the way that we show up? And right now we're actually working with a consulting firm to help us restructure the business itself around non-hierarchical structures so that we can, while still acknowledging that I hold the power, I'm a person who likes to lead by committee. I love input. I want to hear what other people say, what they think, and I want to create a space where people can talk to me which is a place where I have always have room to grow. But doing that in an intentional and structural way in a company is not easy. It's not intuitive because these are models we have to invent. Yes. In the same way that I think of my own experience as being a queer person is that I have to invent my identity as it is specific to me, you know? And it's a lot of by looking at examples of what I don't want to be.
Yes.
And the radicalness of the people that I admire. It's funny. So we have two walls in the office. One is in the kitchen that is a shared space, communal space, and that's the wall of equity and inclusion. It has just pictures of people who are inspiring, like the Guerrilla Girls or Justice Adrienne Nelson here in Oregon, or Dr. King or Alice Walker, or, you know, whoever it might be. And then on my own wall in my office, I have pictures of people who inspire me. And it's funny, I looked at them recently. I was like, oh, so interesting. Everyone is androgynous in some specific way. So there's Divine on there. There's Mapplethorpe, a self-portrait of Mapplethorpe. There's a self-portrait of a portrait of Patti Smith taken by Mapplethorpe because their relationship is so lovely. There's a picture of Pina Bausch dancing. Yeah. There's Janelle Monáe, my great love. If only she knew. And people who I've realized, I'm like, that's what I'm looking for, is how do you show up and hold the whole gender spectrum in the way we behave and operate in the world and feel a sense of permission to perform our gender in the way that feels authentic to us, you know? And I think that's true in how I show up as a leader, as a planner, and as a human in the world.
Yeah, I love this idea of really getting clear on the type of leader that you want to be and just the democratic approach that you take, you know, this kind of very collaborative approach. And you're right, there aren't many models of that, though I love, you know, in the work that I do around equity and inclusion, I love the wall that you have. such a great example of your commitment there. But just this idea of inclusive leadership and that like there are more leaders that are trying to take that approach and getting really clear on what that means. And there's lots of different traits around that. But two that came up for me as you were talking where I'm like, yes, that's inclusive leadership, is just the curiosity that you have of, I'm able to talk about what I want because I am the CEO. But by doing that, you know, are there other voices that I'm, you know, overriding or like I'm not hearing because people are maybe because of the way we have grown up in a culture that is so hierarchical, right? That, well, we would never question the CEO, right? But like you're kind of creating these opportunities of soliciting feedback because it is lonely running a business, right? And it's so valuable getting any kind of feedback, right? So the fact that you're building that into your own workplace culture it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. So
I'm trying. It's all try though. Let's emphasize that verb because I'm certainly not there yet, but it's a delightful journey to get there. I can tell you that. Yeah.
And it's, you know, these are promising practices, right? I mean, this is a, you know, to be a more inclusive organization, you know, if we were there and there were many examples, we wouldn't have to be talking about this, right? And it wouldn't feel like we're grasping at, okay, what's working well in other places. So that too is kind of like that collage that we were talking about before. What kind of culture do you want to create? It sounds like you're on that path. So speaking of paths and our journeys within the Rainbow family, I wanted to talk a little bit about the gifts of the journey of being a part of the Rainbow family. And specifically, like in the context of the workplace, based off of your lived experiences, do you feel like you've gleaned some superpowers from being queer that allows you to stand out in business?
Yes. One of the reasons I decided to start my own firm was because I was shocked by the culture of conformity that dominates the industry. And quite honestly, mediocrity as well. I mean, the mediocreness or just negative products that are put out there, financial systems that are out there, the business models themselves are not oriented to the client's best interest. It's deeply frustrating for me. And so what I started the firm so that I could basically show up as my authentic self, which is I'll always be a deeply queer person, along with all my other identities that create this amalgam that is Georgia Lee Hussey. And so I think what is helpful for me is that I'm not in it for the money. I'm not in it for the fame. I'm not in it for the power. What I'm in it for is this desire to change things. I love being good at my jobs. I love being a great planner. I love being a good CEO or learning to be a good CEO. I love being a good boss, all that good stuff. I love showing up in community with other founders and leaders, especially here in Oregon. We've got something really special going on in this state. But I think I've had other people say to me how much they admire the way I just show up as myself. And that's because I'm queer.
Yeah.
And it's because I've had to do that since I was a kid.
Yeah.
Because there was no fitting in, which made me really value being an outsider. Mm-hmm. I love being an outsider. I don't want to fit in.
Yeah. There's something comfortable about that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't mind taking up space. I don't mind that feels really gratifying to me. And I think especially people who show up as femme in the world, however their identities might intersect with that term, it is an identity that takes up space and demands attention. And I like that,
Yeah.
It's fun showing up for this meeting in my black Texas tuxedo and red lipstick and big hair,
Yes.
I like that I get to live in a world that I get to do that, and it's something I want to create permission for other people to show up as their authentic selves too. Yeah. Because as a kid growing up without other queers around, I was really confusing and I didn't know who I could be and who I couldn't be. And in some ways in the middle of Akron, Ohio, that was gratifying. And when I got to Sarah Lawrence, I was like, oh, there's this butch thing and this femme thing and you're supposed to be this thing or that thing. And I was like, wait, this is confusing. It feels like, the Heathers or something.
Yes. It's like other boxes you have to jump into. You're like,
totally.
wait, I want to opt out.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
On that piece, there's something to that as well, right? Where to be in queer space, you're figuring things out, and there isn't necessarily, again, it's I don't know. I mean, I guess there are some archetypes you can conform to, but I think you're less likely to conform because you have to figure it out on your own, especially if you're coming out as a senior in high school in Akron, Ohio. Probably not a massive LGBT community center down the street for you to find.
I didn't know anybody else. All I remember was Barnes & Noble, the gay and lesbian section, because that's what it was called at that point.
Yep.
And the poetry section was right nearby. So I would read the poetry section and surreptitiously put my arm back and grab Ruby Fruit Jungle.
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. I went to Notre Dame for undergrad, and that's where I came out. And I was on the 10th floor of the library in that section. That was totally my approach of I'm going to read everything because I have no cultural touch points, that are positive, right? I mean, granted, that was the late 90s, so
exactly,
things are
me
different.
too.
Yeah, things are a little different, thankfully.
Yeah, it's so amazing how different they are.
Yeah.
I'm so excited that kids don't have to do that, and how lucky were we, because we were growing up in the 90s, not at a time where queer bars and restaurants were getting hazed by the police, or people were getting, Stonewall had happened,
yes.
So we are so lucky, and the progress we've made around sexual identity or gender identity is significant. Of course, not as far as we need to go, but
sure.
I didn't expect that we would have marriage equality at this point in my life.
Yeah.
I did not.
Yeah. It's it's mind-blowing that we've sped up so much, even from the late 90s. Definitely from Stonewall. And then, right, at Stonewall, too, we still have young kids that are getting rejected from their family. The same young people that really had nothing to lose, kids of color getting profiled by police then. Still, these are challenges now. I think what's great, right, is that we have, in the context of this show, we're LGBT business owners. We're contributing, to our states, our cities, wherever we're located. And we have a voice, we're giving back. We're a part of the system, for better or worse. And so there is some social capital where we can raise some of these issues to say, yeah, we have marriage equality and we're doing great. And like you said, because we're contributing our taxes, that we want to make sure that those that are stewards of our tax levy, are investing in programs and taking care of our communities too, right? And so there is a place in that. And I think the more of us that understand how to be smart about using our money, investing our money, planning financially, I think that makes us better at influencing these systems that haven't thought of us, right? Kind of given some of the challenges we've talked about being more authentic in the workplace, especially if we are working for other people at this point, and the gifts of the journey, what would you want our listeners to take away just to show up more authentically during the best waking hours of their day when they're working?
I find that the wall of inspiration practice is really helpful for me. If you don't have a space where you can have those images out at your desk or in your office, Maybe they're on your phone. Maybe it's a file or a Pinterest or something that lets you keep close access to your heroes, because I find that is really grounding for me on a day-to-day basis. Again, I would say get clear about your money stories, because when we make decisions from an unconscious place, we can't use the power that we have intentionally for what we believe in. And so I think that clarity is really important. If your audience is interested, you can go to our website and there's a download of a toolkit of 3 different forms that help you start to discover your relationship with money. They're really great, and they make wonderful conversation tools. So you can have conversations with your partner, with your friends, with your parents, with other folks in your community to really help have these conversations about who we are as financial beings. Because I think that will help us unstick the problems, the rough spots in how we operate in the world, and use the power that is money if we're lucky enough to have access to it.
Yes, I love this. It's lots of manifesting in there, right? Okay, so we are at that point in the interview where we are winding things down. And Georgia, you had mentioned these really amazing worksheets of just kind of getting us thinking about our relationship to money, hopefully improving it. Where can we find that? Where can we find more about you? And especially for folks who are like, I want to work with Georgia. Where do I sign up?
Yeah, so modernistfinancial.com has all the information. There's some really great tools there under resources. We have the money toolkit that you can download. There's also a referrals page that has all of my opinions on who you should hire as a financial planner. I think the main things are you should hire a CFP, someone who's a fiduciary, somebody who's fee only, somebody who puts your interests first, basically. Ideally, they practice financial life planning like I do, and there are people out there. So all the resources and tools you need are there. Our firm is very oriented towards complex financial lives. So our minimum for a new client is quite high. So our minimum is $1 million of investable assets, which is outside of most people's range. So we do our very best to put as much resources and information out there for folks as we can. Hopefully we'll be able to scale and be able to serve the whole income spectrum. That's certainly my goal. But that referrals page and then our blog is just full of information on investing and hiring folks. And the Money Stories talk. So we've got tons of different conversations that you can have with your community about how to engage around money. So there's a lot of stuff there. Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn. Please follow us. We'd love to.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm sure people will follow up there. And also, if you're not there yet at that $1 million level, right, that's also a challenge to you around, what's getting in the way? Like, imagine it now, right? And so you have homework. So, okay. So just to wrap up, so we talked about you were able to share a little bit of advice for our listeners around how they can show up more authentically at work. For those folks who haven't yet taken the leap to get started as an entrepreneur, and chances are they're listening to the show because they're looking for some guidance from folks like you, what would you say to those folks to get started?
So I'm a pretty practical person at heart, so I love cash flow. As I like to say, cash flow is queen and she needs to be respected. So I am a big proponent of cash flow projections. If you're thinking about starting a company, I am a modeler by nature. I think it's my art practice as well. It's like I just want sketches and maquettes to see what is this thing going to look like.
Yes.
And so for me, that is the cash flow spreadsheet. So I would recommend that you just, income, expenses, taxes, really basic addition and subtraction, and just see where you end up and do it on a month-by-month basis so you can see where you're going to be in the future. So for me, I have a 2-year spreadsheet that I'm updating all the time. I look at it 2 or 3 times a week as I make decisions in the company so that I know what my cash flow position is going to be at the end of every month. And I take a super conservative perspective on the income and a pretty aggressive perspective on the expenses. So that I can come up with money I am very likely to have in the future. Because, there are 4 or 5 people that depend on me for their income, and that is a very heavy responsibility that I want to steward with all of the ease that I can. And I feel like that is whether you have employees or not, you might have contractors or you might have expenses that you need to maintain. So I love taking care of the cash. I would say that is, to me, it's about sketching and modeling and visioning and heroes again. It's all the same project for me. So think about it like a performance art project or an installation that you're doing. Is like, what are all the things you might need and how could you how could you draw those out or in some way sketch it out so you can see yourself in this position?
Yeah, cash is queen. Great advice there. And also this idea of building a business into an art project. So I think you are totally vibing with all of the creative entrepreneurs out there right now who are like, yes, I get that analogy. I'm going to do it that way. It also sounds way more fun when you're like, it's just like an art sketch.
Yeah, business is so fun. I mean, if you had told my 19-year-old self that, I would have said she was a crazy person and cussed her out. But business is so creative. It's basically the same thing as making art. You're just adding dollars to it.
Yes.
And potentially having a greater impact. So.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have you back on the show in the future and maybe do some kind of class or something. But this was really great. Thank you for swinging by the studios. All of the materials that you shared on where your website is at will be included in our show notes. So for folks who are tuning in, please go and check out outentrepreneur.com, and you will find all of this great material, notes from today's conversation, all that good stuff over there. Again, thank you so much for tuning into the show. Georgia, thank you for being on the show. It was a real pleasure getting to know you and learning more about your business. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, I encourage you to please go ahead and do that. It's the best way to get the show known. And if you like this content, please let me know, because like what we were talking about earlier, feedback is really, really treasured, and it's hard to come by when you're running your own business. So I'd love to hear your impressions of the show, ideas that you have to make it stronger and better so that you get more out of it. And as always, I encourage you to keep showing up, keep being authentic 100% of the time, and I will talk with you next week.